Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another one of my regular updates. I can't think of a time in all my time in the Senate when there may be a more sobering update than what I'm going to report to you today. The world order that has existed post-World War II for literally the last 80 years is in real time being upset by the unprovoked attack by the Russians, led by Vladimir Putin, into the independent nation, democratic nation of Ukraine. And I want to go through what I'm hearing as chairman of the Intelligence Committee. Recognize I can't give out any specific intelligence about the state of play right now. And let me go through the good and then the not so good about what we can see and expect over the coming days and weeks. First, I think the whole world has been impressed by the resilience of the Ukrainian people. Their soldiers, their individual citizens standing up to overpowering Russian military might. The President Zelensky, almost in a Churchillian way, rallying his people and rallying the world. And clearly, Vladimir Putin miscalculated, and the Ukrainian resistance has been much, much stronger than was expected. I also think about the fact that 10 days ago, I was in Munich, Germany, with a number of our NATO allies at a major defense and security conference. And while the American intelligence has been absolutely brilliant in terms of predicting what Putin would do and frankly catching Putin off guard, as the intelligence community has shared virtually real time that intelligence with our allies and with the world, it's taken away any attempt or any validity that Putin could have had of saying that somehow this war was started by the Ukrainians. Russians have been usually pretty good at information warfare. This time the American intelligence and the sophistication of President Zelensky to use social media, we are way outdistancing the Russians. And in 10 days, we've seen the West, and not just the West, but allies around the world stand up in ways that 10 days ago, in my wildest dreams, I couldn't have hoped for or predicted. We've seen cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We've seen the Europeans take the lead in kicking banks out of the SWIFT system. We've seen sanctions on the Russian central bank, so even though the reserves that Russia has put together can't be fully accessed. We've seen Germany literally reverse course, not only in terms of sending arms to Ukraine, but also saying they're going to finally meet their commitment on national defense for their country and for NATO. We've seen countries like the Netherlands and the Finns and the Swedes, for the first time ever, send arms into a conflict that's taking place in Ukraine. We're seeing Switzerland, which most of us have all grown up with knowing is the ultimate neutral country, come off the sidelines and weigh in terms of the sanctions. We've seen Vladimir Putin himself sanctioned. He now joins the rogue gallery of people like Gaddafi and Assad as being one of the only world leaders sanctioned by the rest of the world. We've also even seen Russian citizens, as these images have gotten through, rise up at a low level at this point in protest. And some of the people who benefited most from Putin, the oligarchs, are starting to push back and saying this is hitting them in their wallets. And I hope we and the British and Swiss and others will go after these ill-gotten gains of the oligarchs who've got billions of dollars spread all over the world, a lot of it in the UK. All that positive. On the negative side, or on the challenging side going forward, the Russians, because they miscalculated, are only now throwing in their last third of the troops that were amassed around Ukraine. And we see images of literally 40-mile-long convoys of Russian tanks and troop carriers advancing on Kyiv. We see the Russians as well starting to indiscriminately bomb population centers. The The fact is the Ukrainian military are outmatched. We need to get them additional weapons, and Congress needs to act now on both humanitarian assistance and additional weapons, combining with our European allies. But it would be unrealistic to think that the Ukrainians can hold out forever with these overwhelming odds posed against them with the Russian military. But I would pose as well that even if the Russians are able to take out the Ukrainian military, we have literally hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who've been armed, who are clear about the fact that they will rise up in an insurgency against their Russian oppressors. We also have not seen what I expected, and I think the intelligence community expected, was that for Russia to launch major cyber attacks against Ukraine. I've been concerned since day one of this conflict that a major Russian cyber attack that took down, for example, the power and water in Ukraine might spread to Poland, and that could affect NATO troops or shut down Polish hospitals where Polish citizens would then die. Poland is a NATO nation. Could that rise to the level of an Article 5 violation of the NATO treaty that would say when any NATO nation is attacked, they're all attacked, and put NATO in direct conflict with Russia? That still is a possibility. It's amazing to me that we're 6 days into this invasion and Russia still hasn't shut down the internet or shut down the communications networks in Ukraine. I think they have the capacity. I think they just assumed that this was the Ukrainians going to roll over much easier. But those videos that we see every day of Ukrainian citizens may be one of the most powerful tools that the world has against Putin. And I've been surprised that they haven't been shut off. But I think we can't rule that out happening as the Russians up the ante in Ukraine. I think here in the West and in America directly, we also have to be very conscious of the threat of cyber attacks from Russia. We've seen the Russian ruble drop by 30% in the last few days. We've seen the Russian markets close. We're seeing the Russian economy literally crumble before our eyes. And I think we should expect the Putin to unleash cyber attacks against our country and other NATO nations. That may come in the form of direct attacks, trying to hit our financial institutions. It may come in the form of him unleashing the literally thousands of Russian cyber criminals to launch ransomware attacks against American businesses and other institutions. We have raised our shields as high as we possibly can, but the truth is, you take a first-tier nation like Russia in terms of their cyber capabilities, and they literally have hundreds, if not thousands, of cyber weapons, chances are they will get into some of our networks. So the key things is our resilience. Can we bring our networks back up as quickly as possible? And one of the things that we have heard from our cyber experts, both in the public sector and the private sector, and Congress needs to act on this week. We need to join other industrial nations in the world and have a mandatory requirement that if you are attacked in a cyber attack, you have to tell the government, not so the government can do anything against you, but so that we can actually warn other people in the private sector of these kind of attacks. Right now, it's assumed that only about 30% of the cyber attacks are actually relayed to CISA, the Independent Cybersecurity Agency. We need to change that. I've got legislation that we almost got attached to the defense bill. We need to pass that this week. I also think we need to step back for a moment, and I'm going to get to the State of the Union in a moment, but I just think we need to step back as well and say, I think we've all been disturbed by the tenor of our partisan politics in our country. I think we've all read stories, is the age of democracy past us? Can Western liberal ideas about transparency and free speech and democracy really stand in a technology-driven world? Well, I hope we all take a deep breath and realize the people of Ukraine are voting literally with their lives to say they would rather put their lives in jeopardy than live under an authoritarian rule. And that they vote for democracy. They vote for free expression. They vote with the West. The fact that so many countries, not only in the West, but Japan, Korea, Kazakhstan, a former Russian ally, standing against Russia. Australia, I met with them today, their intelligence communities, all saying we stand together as democracies. We've got a lot of things we can do to improve our system, but I think we need to realize our democratic, liberal-based democracy is still the best in the world. And we need to follow suit to our Ukrainians and be willing to defend it and stand by those values and stand against those who tear it down, whether they be foreign or domestic. And that moves me to the second half of my open comments about the State of the Union tonight. I hope President Biden will convey that message, that the state of our democracy, even though we've got partisan politics, is still strong. Vladimir Putin has not only united Europe and most of the world, he's united the 85-90% of the U.S. Senate to say we are united in standing with the people of Ukraine, standing with NATO, and we cannot allow Putin to be successful in this invasion, not only in the short term, but in the long term. I think President Biden also needs to make clear, because his speech tonight is not only to America, but to the world, and the world will be watching, that we will stand behind our commitments to NATO, that we will also watch and resist any activities by the Communist Party of China in terms of President Xi potentially trying to weaken Taiwan. We need to rally forces not only in Europe, but in Asia against this authoritarian collaboration between Russia and the Communist Party of China. And we need to always make clear our beef is with the Communist Party of China and not with the Chinese people or the Chinese diaspora, Chinese Americans, for example. He also needs to address domestic issues tonight. And while we know the economic numbers in terms of growth and GDP and in terms of unemployment numbers being low, and we have very low unemployment in Virginia, I'm proud of, needs to acknowledge that the American people aren't fully feeling that. That we are tired from the 2 years plus of COVID, that we've seen inflation. I hope tonight he chooses to start turning the page on COVID, because we have all, for the most part, done what was right by our fellow citizens and get vaccinated and worn masks. But now, as the scientific evidence is changing and the COVID levels are down, we need to have a return to normalcy. People will still need to wear masks if they choose to, or if they've got pre-existing conditions, but I think we all start to need to move back to a normal economy. He also needs to address the real concerns around inflation. Prices are going up too fast. This is not just happening in America, it's happening around the world, but even most people here at home, when they see the gas prices, don't think about the rest of the world, they think about their pocketbooks. And those gas prices, because of our sanctions against Russia and Russian energy, could even in the short term go up a little bit more. We need to encourage, to take on inflation, the Federal Reserve to start easing off their easy money policies and slowly raise interest rates to throttle back some of the economy to lower inflation. That's the most effective tool historically that's been used. We need to go ahead in Congress and pass the Semiconductor Chips Act and invest $52 billion in American-built semiconductor facilities, so we don't have, and this won't happen short term, but the kind of shortages we see in semiconductors in our cars. And I had a startup healthcare company in Virginia providing a great product that's seen their semiconductors go from about $6 a piece to over $200 a piece. We need to take on the question of drug prices and bring down, for example, insulin costs to $35 a month. Again, this is where Congress can act in concert with the president. And I hope the president will also make the appeal to all the American people with the potential world crisis we have with Ukraine, with the exhaustion we all feel about COVID, and with the very real challenges around inflation. He needs to bring us together as Americans first. Putin has done that to a degree in terms of how we deal on the international stage. President Biden needs to ask the same of us, to put aside our Democratic and Republican labels for a while and act in behest of all the people of our country. So that's what I'm hoping to hear, and I look forward again to our questions. So with that, let me turn it over to my team, and I know we've got a number of folks queued up, and I'll try to be shorter on my answers so I can get to everybody's questions. Folks, I'm not hearing anything from...
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks for taking my question. I appreciate it. You mentioned the risk of cyber attacks, and I want to kind of also add to that the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. I think a lot of Americans are concerned about direct consequences for us here in the U.S. for being involved in this conflict. Would you say that's an indication that we shouldn't be as involved as we are? And how concerned should Americans be about direct risks, both with cyber attacks and with nuclear weapon use?
Well, the chances of Russia launching some level of cyber attacks is very high. But we need to remember that cyber criminals from Russia and elsewhere are launching cyber attacks every day. They don't get reported, but they are happening on a regular basis. We may see elevation, and if the Russians, the GRU and the FSB, their spy services, launch their top teams, they will probably get into some of our networks. And we have always had as a policy a concern about tit-for-tat cyber escalation, because the challenge is when you release a piece of malware into the wild, particularly if it's got a kind of a worm capabilities to go beyond a single network, you can't control that by geographic boundaries. So, there is enormous concerns about cyber escalation tit-for-tat. Short term, I think we're going to be fine in terms of our resilience of our networks, but it is an area where we have literally hundreds, if not thousands, of cyber weapons. So do the Russians, and we should fear some level of escalation. On Putin's raising his nuclear readiness, he has a lot of weapons. But the truth is, he would not be using this kind of provocative language if he did not feel he was losing on the ground in Ukraine and losing in the court of world opinion. This is somebody who is trying to strike fear because the Ukrainians are not rolling over with his invasion. We have to be very cautious about escalation and having a direct conflict between NATO and Russia. But we cannot walk away from our commitments to NATO. We cannot walk away from continuing to supply our Ukrainian friends with arms. They are not a NATO nation, so we don't have an Article 5 issue there, but we do with Poland, Romania, the Baltic states. And I would say to any American, and I say this as somebody who was the child of the Cold War, 90% of Americans knew that we could not allow the Soviet Union to spread and take out democracies. Many young people have not grown up with that threat. But the authoritarian kind of no freedom, absolute control over the economy and people's lives, if Putin is successful in Ukraine, he will not stop. He will try to remake Europe. We can stop him here, or we can face a kind of Cold War mentality going forward. So I think it's the choice of all of us to stop him in his tracks now with the world united against him. This is a huge, huge challenge, and it affects all of us. The idea that somehow, while I know there may be some political figures that said Putin's a genius, Putin is not a genius. Putin is a bully, a thug, and he needs to be constrained.
Our next question will be from Bill Atkinson with the Petersburg Progress Index.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Good afternoon. Thank you for taking my question, and I hope you can hear me.
Yes, sir, I can.
Okay, great. Thank you. Senator, I spoke with one Virginian last week who is living in Belarus right now. Past 6 years or so teaching English as a second language. Right now, he says everything's okay, and he's trying to go about his everyday life. In the back of his mind, he can't help but think that as time goes on, that's going to change, obviously. He says that if he wants to leave, which he does not right now, he does not expect to immediately come back to the United States. He would probably stay in some place like Poland. It would be easier to get back to than, say, from New York or anywhere else in the United States. My question to you is, what advice would you give to Virginians or U.S. citizens like him who are living in those outlier countries, as well as their family members who are living here and worried about them getting out of harm's way?
Well, Bill, I'm getting a lot of these inquiries as well. So let me tell you, I think if you're an American citizen living in Belarus, you ought to get out of the country as quickly as possible. Belarus is becoming more and more simply a client state of Russia. The Belarusian troops have started to invade Ukraine as well. And I think the sanctions that were put against Russia, you'll start to see them put against Belarus. I think as well, American citizens in Russia ought to start leaving. We made the request 2 weeks ago, for all the Ukrainian American citizens to get out, or American passports in Ukraine to get out. Unfortunately, many people didn't get out because they just didn't believe that Putin would go this far. Putin is a thug and a bully. We are rapidly approaching, a major break in relations. I think the sanctions are going to continue to ratchet up. And I would urge all American citizens in Ukraine, Belarus, Russia to leave. I think one of the things I know I'm trying to work on right now, as well as trying to connect with all of the countries that are adjacent to Ukraine. We're hearing reports that African citizens are being detained at the border, not able to get across. I think we need to stand for free flow of citizens, and those citizens, even if they are not Americans, ought to be able to exit harm's way in Ukraine as well. So short message is to get out, and they ought to try to contact their American consulate services and others if you're in Belarus on the easiest, quickest, fastest way to leave the country.
Our next question will be from Mitchell Miller with WTOP.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Senator. If the Russians take Kyiv, as many intelligence experts expect, despite the valiant fighting of the Ukrainians, what more do you think the U.S. and President Biden, as well as the allies, should be doing after that possibility happens?
Well, Mitchell, one of the things I think we can be assured of is that even if the Russians take Kyiv or take out the Ukrainian military, I think, as we've unfortunately learned, you can take the cities, but can you control the population? I think the Ukrainians are going to fight back. We've seen reports of over 100,000 citizens who've taken up arms in the so-called territorial units. I think there has been planning on how they can resist. We've seen the images of the Ukrainian citizens making Molotov cocktails that they could throw on Russian tanks and troop carriers for an occupying force. So how Russians hold the territory they capture in a military strike is an open question. I think one of the things, if the Russians are successful in taking Kyiv, the hope we have is there could be some level of Ukrainian continuity of government probably in the western part of the country. And I hope America and our NATO allies would still supply that government in exile, or that government in the western part of Ukraine, the kind of supplies and arms they need to continue the struggle. We cannot let Putin's military superiority end up squashing the aspirations and the freedoms that the Ukrainians have enjoyed over the last few years. Remember, the Ukrainians took to the streets 5 or 6 years ago, and we've seen those images in the Maidan, which is the central square in Kyiv, and literally threw out at that point, at cost of many lives, the pro-Russian government. Ukraine wants to be with the West. If we don't stand with those forces, and clearly if we don't stand with our NATO allies, then America's leadership in the world will be undermined. And frankly, that goes beyond American leadership. The whole sense that democracies can stand up to authoritarianism will be undermined.
We're going to move on to Jonathan Weisman from the New York Times. Jonathan?
Hi, Senator. Hi, Senator. I apologize because I'm not local. I'm kind of local. But you've been something of a bridge between the broader Democratic Party in the Senate and Joe Manchin and more conservative Democrats. And I wanted to ask you, ahead of the State of the Union, what prospects you see for President Biden's domestic agenda, specifically Build Back Better. And do you think that for political purposes and for legislative purposes, Democrats should emphasize smaller bipartisan bills going into the political season?
Well, Jonathan, as you know, and I think most of my friends and from media know, I work in the only place in America where being a gang member is a good thing. Anytime there's been a bipartisan group, I've been part of that. And working with my friends like Joe Manchin, we put together the bipartisan infrastructure bill. That's extraordinarily important for job growth. It's extraordinarily important in terms of long-term economic competitiveness with the rest of the world. And those resources are getting out, whether they're broadband, bridges, roads, increased support for our ports and transit. So if we can move on a bipartisan basis on other parts around drug prices, there is bipartisan effort, for example, around the semiconductor bill. If there are bipartisan efforts around child care, we ought to move forward on those. But if there are certain areas as well, for example, back to child care, if we can't find Republican partners, I still have hopes that we can make a substantial investment in child care, because that is one of the tools that we can use to cut down on inflation. We get more people back into the workforce, that cuts back on inflation. And I know from friends and experience that there's an awful lot, particularly of people with young families, where one of the spouses, generally the mom, hasn't gone back to the workforce because they can't find affordable child care. So I think that both improves quality of life and also takes on inflation. I think there are a number of areas on that. And listen, I think this is still a very real possibility, and I think some of this needs to be recast, particularly around how we can grapple with inflation. That is something Senator Manchin's concerned with. That's something I'm concerned with. I think the president is concerned with that as well, and that's where a lot of the American people are at. But if we can show how some of these programs take on inflation, I say this as a father of a daughter with type 1 diabetic, and thank God I've been able to afford the price of her insulin that's gone up in the 20 years close to 20 years she's had diabetes. But a whole lot of families cannot, and that's not just type 1, but type 2 as well. And bringing down diabetes or bringing down insulin cost to $35 a month, that's smart policy. That also helps again on inflation.
Our next question will be from Michael Martz with the Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Yes, good afternoon. I've got a twofold question related to Virginia. One is the effect of the Ukrainian the invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions against Russia on the space program through Wallops Island, with the Antares supply to the International Space Station. But also, Governor Youngkin has raised his voice in support of Ukraine and calling for the state agencies to eliminate purchases of Russian products. He's asked VRS to look at its investment. How do you see that in terms of the partisan debate, where you've had former President Trump and others on the Republican right really siding with Putin to some degree?
Well, Michael, let me just say, if you look back over the last 5 days, there's virtually no one in the world who's saying good things about Vladimir Putin or calling him smart or a genius other than the former president. And I'll let people make their own judgments on that. And I would also point out that it was actually Senator Louise Lucas who first raised the issue, I believe over the weekend, that our Virginia ABC stores shouldn't be selling Russian vodka. And I'm glad to see that the governor and others in both parties jumped on that. And I do think we need to re-examine whether it's VRS or state agencies doing business with Russia. We are trying to economically boycott them and cut back and make these sanctions hurt. And I think the more we can do as a state and as a community, I support Governor Youngkin on that. And we've also seen already BP oil, Shell oil, selling out of the major Russian energy companies, I believe Gazprom and Rosneft. So I think we need to move on all those fronts. In terms of the issue of collaboration in space, I was with Bill Nelson, the NASA administrator, last Thursday in Hampton at the NASA Langley Center. And at that moment in time, we still thought we could continue this collaboration with the Russians in space. We have Russians in our NASA station in Houston. As you know, we've got folks using some Russian rockets. I hope one of the things this drives us to is whether it's Elon Musk's rockets or other American based rockets, and commercial space is one of the areas that's the fastest growing in the country and in the world, and I support those investments. But this kind of economic break with Russia could lead to all kinds of spin-offs, and I'm not surprised to see some of our cooperation in space break down. I do hope, back to the earlier question though, we've got to maintain open lines of communication with Russia, because whether it would be a cyber attack in Ukraine that would cause a Article 5 violation of an adjacent NATO country, or mistakes being made when you've got Russia at a heightened nuclear state. These are things that, again, folks, Michael, your age and mine, have thought about kind of growing up through most of our lives. Younger people haven't had to experience. We need to keep open those lines of dialogues with the Russians so somebody doesn't make a miscalculation. And one of the reasons where we are right now is because Vladimir Putin, who's been an authoritarian leader for 20 years, over the last 2 years, due to COVID and due to whatever else is happening, has gotten more and more removed from everyday contact with a host of other Russian leaders. I think anybody who's seen these images when a visiting European or American leader comes in, Putin sits at one end of the table, 30 feet away, the visiting leader sits in, or even when he's had his military or economic advisors. This is a guy that's detached and removed. For most of the last 2 years, he's been at his dacha in Sochi in the south, or one of his houses outside of Moscow, and the number of people who are giving him inputs are generally a group that doesn't want to make the boss mad. So I'm not sure he's getting independent judgments that any leader of any nation has. So we are in, again, uncharted territory here. But your basic question around Virginia stepping up, I think Virginia, and I hope other states do as well, to make sure this economic harm can rein Putin in.
Our next question will be Brittany Furrow with WSLS. Brittany?
Hi, it's actually McKinley Struggle with WSLS. Senator, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. You said that you want to put labels aside. And so thinking about everything that we have going on in our own country outside of Ukraine, and then including that into the conversation as well, how important do you think it is that the president speaks in, I guess, some type of unifying bipartisan way tonight in the State of the Union address? And then how do we actually achieve that moving forward?
Well, I think he needs to call upon all of us as Americans to step up. You know, we have a disruption to the kind of the world peace that's basically existed since the end of the Second World War, real time happening. We've got a independent nation of 44 million people brutally attacked by Russia, and now them upping the shelling, using cluster munitions, and a host of things that are clearly aimed at citizen population. We have a moment in time where the rest of the world is rallying to the side of Ukraine and the idea of liberal democracies. And the rest of the world, I met with the Australian intelligence community leaders today. They look to America to be that world leader. So I believe Biden needs to speak to that. And I think ask us to step up. I do hope, and I found, as I said earlier, the vast majority of the men and women I work with in the Senate, we're on the same page in terms of supporting Ukraine, NATO, and making sure Putin is punished. But it is bizarre to me that there are members of the Senate, they are far right-wing members, that are continuing to hold up people who are appointees of President Biden, people in the State Department. We still don't have an ambassador in Ukraine. We've had literally dozens of people for the intelligence community and the State Department, even in some areas at DOD, that have not been confirmed because of purely partisan mischief. I wish the Senate would go ahead and change the rules so that one man or woman can't, on pure egotistical reasons, shut down the Senate. That would be a step in the right direction. But at the end of the day, this is going to require some level of self-policing by all of us. If we're hired by our respective states to be their representatives in Washington, I believe with that comes a level of personal responsibility. And simply throwing bombs at the opposition, and this happens in both parties, let me be clear, but that is not productive at this moment of crisis. If there's ever a time for us, particularly in terms of politics ending at our shoreline, that it was the rule of thumb through most of my life, we need to return to that right now because we've never had as much of a threat. And I would say we're rapidly moving even past what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've never had as much of a threat as we do right now.
Our next question will be Claire Galt with ABC 13.
Hello, good afternoon. My question is about gas prices. Some Republicans are once again criticizing the president for killing the Keystone Pipeline. They say it would have helped us move towards energy independence and eventually bring down gas prices. Looking back now, do you think that was a mistake to kill it? And some are suggesting we dip into the reserves to bring down these costs. What are your thoughts on that in this plan?
Well, I hope you know that I broke with my party on the Keystone Pipeline. I thought it needed to be included in an all-of-the-above solution to our energy needs. And I think we are going to need, in terms of gas and oil, over the short term, if there are ways we can increase production during this crisis, it has to be on the table. But I also know, I say to my friends in Hampton Roads who see flooding happening on a monthly, if not weekly basis, we see reports coming out of the United Nations and other American bodies that the challenge around climate change, and we see this with severe weather events, is real. So short term, particularly during this short-term crisis, are there things we can do? They ought to be on the table. But long term, the challenge to move away, and I honestly believe that part of that moving away, we ought to do more nuclear power, and that offends, frankly, people on both sides, but it is carbon-free and a clean energy source. It has to be part of the mix. The question around gas prices, if we can release additional reserves from what's called the SPRO, the Strategic Reserve, I'm open to that. But we got to recognize standing up against Russia, standing up against Russian energy could mean in the short term higher energy prices across the whole world, and that will affect prices here in America. But the notion that we're willing to sacrifice our values, sacrifice the people of Ukraine, and allow Russia to kind of carry through on its energy policies, that's not a trade I'm willing to do.
We have time for one more question from Gene Moreno with WFIR.
Hi, Senator. I hope you have an answer. Decided to step away for a few minutes, but it's very frustrating watching these images on TV of Ukraine. My question is, can't NATO supply more ammo, tanks, planes, assuming there is a Ukrainian air defense? Is there, or are we afraid of poking the bear, and also is there a tipping point where some kind of troops might go in, even on humanitarian grounds?
Two-part question. One, I have enormous respect for what the Ukrainians are doing. And I think President Zelensky has been an inspirational leader. I think we'd asked at one point, some of us had said, well, with this crisis comes, is Zelensky going to be like President Ghani from Afghanistan, who cut and ran the first time the Taliban were moving forward, or is he going to be like Prime Minister Churchill was for the British during World War II? Clearly, he's been like Churchill. But you need to have the facts, and the facts are that the Ukrainian government did not call up its reserves, even though we begged them for weeks on end. And I have some sympathy for President Zelensky. He didn't want to disrupt the economy, and so many people living in that part of the world didn't really believe that Putin would be this brutal. So not having enough of the reserves, that still wouldn't have it would have extended perhaps their resistance, but it wouldn't have at the end of the day measurably changed the outcome. We also know that in terms of the arms that are going in, that we continue to ship across literally on a daily basis, and the fact that other nations that have arms closer to Ukraine, the Germans, for example, releasing some of the arms they sent to the Baltic nations, they will get across the border, I believe, literally in the coming days. Getting those arms distributed to Ukrainian forces or the Ukrainian insurgency, if the military actually is defeated, I think will show that Russia may be able to take these cities, but can they hold the cities? But I gotta tell you, I don't see from the American public or from even the nations in NATO, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO, that they're prepared to put NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine. That would put us to the brink of all-out war, potentially nuclear war. And again, you think I made mention about the cyber tit-for-tat escalation as something that gets into a gray area. I'm 67 years old, and what I lived with through all my life, remembering, having school drills where you hid under your desk in case there was a nuclear attack. Not that hiding under your desk would do much, but that is a future that is unthinkable, and is one of the reasons why NATO comes with the assurance. I believe all those concerns about Ukraine are off, though, if Putin violates sovereignty of any of the 30 NATO nations. Then we do have to step in, troops full bear. But we are, again, in very, very dangerous area here. I hope and pray that the economic harm that the Russian people are feeling will put pressure on Putin. I think the fact that some of the oligarchs, there was one oligarch named Oleg Deripaska who was very involved helping Putin when he interfered in our elections in 2016. He was a big buddy of Putin. He's even speaking out against Putin because it is a disaster what he is doing over the short term and long term for the Russian people. Will that be enough to draw Putin back in, who's somebody who's been an absolute leader for 20 years, somebody who's been removed? Time will tell. But I'll close with what I started. If you'd asked me 10 days ago, would the West be as united? Would we have all these tools at our hands? Would the world have rallied as strongly as they have? I would have been very skeptical. I'm proud they have. A lot of that goes credit to the Ukrainian people and President Zelensky. Thank you all very much. Stay safe, and I hope the President makes that rallying call to all of us tonight and does a great job. Thank you all.